The election may be over, but another campaign is underway, and that, of course, is the Labor leadership campaign. Let's bring in Peter Hartcher, the political editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. And Peter, just when we hadn't had enough campaigning, look, Labor's done a remarkable job, as we've kept saying for a long time now, of keeping it together, remaining unified over the last 6 years under Bill Shorten. It seems a little bit like there was some pent-up tension. The cork's finally been released, and now with Anthony Albanese running, Chris Bowen was dithering a bit yesterday, but today's declared his hand. Tanya Plibersek's not running. Jim Chalmers still thinking about it, but from what I'm just told, in the last half hour or so, his thinking has been impacted by Chris Bowen's decision, so I'd say he's less likely to be a candidate. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of jockeying going on. What do you make of all of this right now in the Labor Party?
Well, as you say, the longer the pressure is pent up, the bigger the explosion at the end of it, and it's getting a little bit frantic and a little bit ugly at the moment behind the scenes in the Labor Party. I think that Albanese is the obvious successor. He won the party ballot amongst the rank and file last time. He's a unifying figure. He gets cross-factional support left and right. He's well known. He has very high recognition in the electorate, and he's also, let's not discount the popularity factor. If Bill Shorten's lack of popularity was a major problem, and it was a disqualifying factor in the end, then a bit of popularity isn't a bad idea, and recognition. And Albanese has all of that. Plus, he has, as he's sort of touched on today and almost bragged about, he has authenticity. And if you can fake authenticity, as they say in the classics, David, you got it made. So for all those reasons, he's the standout candidate. But there's been a frenetic canvassing in the party to put someone up against him to make sure that it's not unopposed Albo, to the point where it seems to have become an anyone but Albo effort. And as you say, Chris Bowen...
And what's that about, Peter? Yeah, so I'm told Bill Shorten was, one of those urging Bowen to step up for that reason, to stop Albanese. This anything or anyone but Albo sentiment, is that... I mean, you can kind of understand Bill Shorten perhaps having a strong view, given they were old leadership rivals 6 years ago. But where else does that come from?
I think it just comes from the long-standing, the very same old personal and factional frictions that were there. Albanese was a fevered Kevin Rudd supporter right to the end, and you'll remember him tearfully, all of that stuff. So a lot of that stuff and resentment hasn't gone away. His only barely concealed leadership ambitions of the last 6 years, and his barely concealed ability to restrain himself has been held against him. So there's all of that there. But as a senior Labor person pointed out to me today, the last time Labor ran an anyone but campaign for the leadership, they came up with Mark Latham. So it's not necessarily the best reflex.
No, indeed. And look, Chris Bowen did say today that he won't be a candidate for deputy. I think most likely, from where we sit right now, Peter, and very likely, is Albanese as leader, Jim Chalmers as deputy. Let me ask you about the contest itself, though, because this is still a relatively new thing in Australian politics, in the Australian Labor Party. They've done it once before, 6 years ago. They're going to do it now again. In the US, we see the Democrat and Republican primary process very well entrenched. We've got a field of 20-plus Democrats right now jockeying for to be the presidential candidate next year. Even in the British Labor Party, they've had these contests now for a while. Do you think they're a good thing for a party that's just gone or just been kept in opposition at the start of a term to go through this process? Is it a good thing, or is it just divisive and messy?
I think it is a good thing, partly because if you accept what most Australians accept, which is that one of the great dysfunctions and most frustrating elements of Australian politics in the last decade has been the restlessness and the pointlessness of the leadership changes, then anything that adds ballast and adds some sense of purpose and measure to leadership decisions has to be a good thing. So I think we saw with Labor in this last run-through, with the membership ballot of the rank and file, it did add ballast. It does make the whole leadership structure, if you like, less topsy-turvy. The leader is less likely to blow over in a faint breeze. It does give the rank and file a sense of ownership, as well as just stabilising the whole operation. And it does give a wider competition, which, if we believe in competition and, we live in a capitalist economy and it's a democracy as well, you have to believe in competition, then that can't be a bad thing.
Let's turn to the Reserve Bank Governor's speech today, Peter. So we're 3 days after the election. Whether he was deliberately waiting till after the election to say all this, it's quite significant what Philip Lowe has said. The economy does need a bit more stimulus, is the message, whether that's the tax cuts, whether that's an interest rate cut that is well and truly flagged 2 weeks ahead of it coming. What did you make of this speech today?
I thought that in central banker terms, this is a scorcher of a speech. Central bankers never use ordinary language, and they'll never use clear language, they'll never use declarative language, and they'll certainly never use colourful language if they can avoid it. And Phil Lowe has kept the rules with all of that. But if you look at the content of what he said, this is a bit of a warning of an imminent economic emergency. And you'll recall that the current level of official interest rates in Australia, the Reserve Bank's 1.5%, was already described by the bank as emergency levels, lower than it was during the financial crisis. So he has signalled today that the bank is going to consider going even below that level, and saying it that plainly and that openly is a pretty clear signal that that's what's going to happen. Plus, he's called on the government to stimulate further with what he calls fiscal support. In other words, more tax cuts, more spending, more infrastructure spending, and other more what he called structural policies in favour of employment, industrial relations policy, and perhaps wages policy as well. So for a central bank governor to step outside his portfolio of monetary policy and speak about fiscal policy, industrial relations policy, the whole panoply of economic policy, and to warn that there's a slowdown underway, is really a shot across the government's bow, warning the government that it needs to act and act more than it had imagined it would need to act before the election if it wants to keep economic growth up and employment growth up.
Well, just on that, Peter, I mean, the tax cuts that the government took to the election will flow, maybe not on July 1, but, as Josh Frydenberg's pointed out today, when they can reconvene Parliament, it can flow automatically once it's passed through the Parliament. They'll probably have to break it up, though, to get just the low and middle income tax cuts through for now. But beyond that, further spending on top of what they took to the election, let alone industrial relations change. Josh Frydenberg did this afternoon seem to dampen down expectations there, saying we're going to keep the budget surplus that we've projected. We're not about to ruin that.
Well, he has to, and the returned government has to project economic confidence, and they can't give any sense that they've undercooked the economy, especially when they just spent 5 weeks campaigning on it as the centrepiece of their claim to power. So really what Phil Lowe is doing is forcing the government to cast its mind 6 and 12 months ahead to think about how it's going to support growth. So the government can't at the moment admit that it needs to go further, but what Phil Lowe has clearly said is tantamount to an economic emergency warning, and letting the government know that regardless of what it says publicly, it needs to start considering major plans to support the economy. Privately, David, Phil Lowe has been urging the then Treasurer, Scott Morrison, now Prime Minister, for years to step up the level of infrastructure spending in the economy. Long-term investment at a time of very low international interest rates, so it's a good time to borrow money, but also infrastructure that adds to the economic capacity and the potential of the country. Lowe has been pestering Morrison at social events and other functions for years to do more, and now he's saying the economy's at a point where it's really going to need it.
Final one for Scott Morrison this week. No doubt he is turning his attention to the ministry. You'd expect by the end of the week we might hear something on that front. He does have a lot of authority after this election win, purely on his shoulders. Should he use that authority, do you think, Peter, to make some significant changes to the front bench that he really inherited 8 months ago?
You're right, he could if he really wanted to. He signalled all the way along that he didn't intend any dramatic change, that he's very much a steady as she goes kind of operator, and that the government is steady, stable and competent. And he's already nominated the main 5 ministers. There is scope, of course, for making changes and removing some of the liabilities that he's got in his ministry. Particularly, I think, after the election, it's an opportunity for him to address that really sort of poisonous topic within the coalition of energy and climate change policy. We know that the energy market operator has said that the electricity grid is basically on the brink, and the operator says it's intervening in the market day to day, Angus Taylor might not want to stay on and take in that portfolio for energy. Melissa Price doesn't deserve to stay on in environment. She's a liability for the government. So there's an opportunity to move there if Scott Morrison chooses to take it. It's an opportunity to fix the electricity problem. It's an opportunity to try to reconcile the government to the broader national concern over climate change without needing to do anything dramatic or revolutionary. But it's difficult to move Melissa Price because this is a government that's very, very light on women. And it's a very delicate area altogether, but it's one where the government has a liability and should, if it can, try to fix it.
Well, it's a good point because, I mean, while the government's done better than expected in so many parts of Australia, regional areas, Queensland in particular, outer suburban areas, seats like Lindsay and so on, as we saw on Saturday night, those inner urban electorates, the likes of Higgins and Kooyong, big swings against the government, given a real fright there. And Scott Morrison, understandably, and the party director would be looking at all of this thing, OK, how do we sandbag those inner urban seats in Sydney and Melbourne and elsewhere? Environment's a big issue, but also getting, the likes of the new Dave Sharma, who's just picked up the seat or returned the seat of Wentworth to the Liberal fold. It's giving them a bit of a job to do in government as well, and a bit of profile, perhaps a good idea.
Yes, and it's the perfect opportunity now that the chieftains in the civil war of the last 6 years have left the arena. So you've got Tony Abbott out of the parliament, Malcolm Turnbull out of the parliament. It's an opportunity for a reconciliation and no need any longer to have a fierce tribal war between the factions. So those appointments and those policy areas allow Morrison to try to reconcile the party and bring it together for a sense of unity and to get the party back on the same page.
Peter Hartcher, political editor with the Sydney Morning Herald. Good to talk to you. Thanks very much for that. We'll catch up soon.